Republicans have placed black lawmakers nationwide in their crosshairs and have waged a flat-out attack on their seats through gerrymandering. In the redrawing of congressional maps, several black Democrats have been pushed into districts where either the black voting pool has been severely diluted or they are forced to run against another Democratic incumbent. Either way, the end result has become less political power for black communities. While Republican lawmakers like those in North Carolina have claimed that congressional maps are race blind and legal and fair, it's impossible to ignore the number of black tenured Democrats who have had their district essentially erased. In Georgia, Representative Lucy McBath's district has been redrawn to be a primarily Republican district. Last month, she announced she will run against fellow Democrat Representative Carolyn Bordeaux in the newly redrawn 7th congressional district. In Texas, where 2 seats gained in Congress can be attributed to black and brown population growth, Democratic Representative Sheila Jackson Lee and Al Green could be forced to face off in the next election. And in North Carolina, Representative G.K. Butterfield is essentially being pushed into retirement after serving for 9 terms because 35% of the black votes are being drawn out of his district. Earlier this month, I spoke with Representative Emmanuel Cleaver about what appears to be the targeting of black lawmakers.
Members on the floor of the House today are speaking, talking among themselves about the fact that there very well may be intentionality, that African American seats are being targeted, or seats held by African Americans are being targeted.
Joining us to discuss is Niambi Carter, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University. First, Dr. Carter, can there still be any argument for the importance of the black vote when black voters are systematically being removed from their districts where votes are being diluted?
Of course not. I mean, everyone knows at this point that black voters are not only essential, but they are strongly Democratic. And the share of the Republican population is getting smaller nationally. And you see it also at the state level. So it's impossible for them to claim that all of this is just by happenstance. They're just drawing these districts and this is the way it all shakes out. Not if you're getting more seats than you actually occupy in real time, right, in the populace. So we know this is targeting black voters. We know this is targeting black representatives because one of the things that happens here is if you can get rid of senior members on some really important committees, then you can really change how that body in Washington works. And of course it starts locally and at the state level, which is why we have to have our eyes on those balls when we have to redistrict every decade or so.
So what is the recourse here? You know, the many states have already drawn the districts, assigned them into law. We don't have federal legislation yet to deal with gerrymandering. You know, the courts have stepped in some states to say at least we're going to push back the election to let the cases work their way through the courts. But what is the recourse here realistically to deal with this, particularly for these black communities, because some of these states, you know, the voting starts in February.
Well, unfortunately, Charles, this is what many of these state legislatures are banking on, right? That it's going to take so long for the legal appeals to work that these will already have been put into effect. The elections will have happened, and no government is going to say, well, guys, we withdrew the district, so now you have to give up your seat. That's not what happens. So they're banking on the fact that it takes a long time for the legal remedies to happen. What's really going to happen here is what Reverend Barber was talking about in the previous segment, which is people are going to have to outmaneuver, out-register, and really outvote these people. Now that's really difficult because it's not just the fact that they're redrawing districts to dilute black and brown voting power, right? They're also doing things like voter ID laws and other things that have a chilling effect on the democracy. So it makes it less likely that these people will turn out. And we've seen the tricks and shenanigans. This is really old wine in new bottles, but it's kind of on steroids now with no sort of pretense about sort of what the outcomes are supposed to be.
What do you think the impact is going to be practically in Congress, if they're attacking these districts, and in several of these cases, there is going to be someone's going to lose, right? Because if you're going to run against another Democrat, not both of you can't win. Somebody's going to sit home. Butterfield's already decided he's just going to retire because they've already drawn him out of his district. You know, many of the places where this is happening are in southern states where there are large black populations. What happens in the next Congress if the Congressional Black Caucus is so heavily weighted towards urban centers outside of the South? You know, what happens to the shrinking voice of the majority of black Americans who still live in southern states?
And I would say the majority of Americans, right? Because most of the people in this country are not here for Republican politics. And I mean big R Republican. But I will say, I mean, I think you raised some really important issues here about where the geography of the black community is. And that is largely southern, but it's also suburban, not just urban anymore. And we know these rural communities, these pockets around like G.K. Butterfield's district, for example, where you have lots of black folks who live in rural communities. These voices are extremely important because when we're talking about like the Build Back Better bill, this is not just sort of fictitious for these communities. We're talking about infrastructure. We're talking about things like Wi-Fi access, things that are gone. And one of the things that the Congressional Black Caucus has always been is the conscience of Congress. And so when those voices are gone, I don't think that they'll be gone forever. I mean, I think you certainly have other members from other localities that understand the vitality of those voices. But it will be the case that black people will have less representation than they do now. And those black communities that are the most vulnerable will have less of those voices because who is going to be there to talk about what's happening in Emporia, Virginia, and these other parts of the South that we know very well and that many of us have family members and loved ones in. So I absolutely think this will change how that body works, but I don't think it will undermine the labors of the Congressional Black Caucus. They've been around for a long time. I think this is a different moment for them because this is the first time we've seen all of this happen without full coverage of the Voting Rights Act. And of course, things are going to get worse before they get better. But I also think this is a really important time for invention. And as Reverend Barber talked about, you know, it made me think of Jesse Jackson when he ran in 84 and 88, when he said Reagan won by the margin of despair. And I think what we're seeing in these places is that these folks are winning by the margin of despair. And this is a vital time to get people registered, to get people interested in local and state level politics, because all of it is tied together and you can't do one without the other. You don't get national policy, federal policy without paying attention to what's happening in your home state and what's happening in your county.
Niambi Carter, I really appreciate your time. You know, I hope that people can break out of this on a state level. It's really hard to see where the off-ramp is for all of this. But anyway, thank you again for your time.